Imagine this, a calm summer morning, two brothers fishing on a quiet Colorado lake, and their sonar shows a plane that's been missing for 62 years. What would you do if the past suddenly rose from the water right in front of you? If you've ever lost someone without answers, this story will reach your soul. Drop a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and stay until the end, because what they found beneath Silver Pine Lake will leave you speechless. It was the kind of morning people write about in postcards: clear blue skies, gentle light sliding across the still water of Silver Pine Lake, the sound of birds cutting through the quiet. Cole Harrington and his younger brother Mason had set out just after sunrise, the small aluminum boat slicing through the glass-smooth surface. They weren't chasing trophies, they were chasing peace. Cole had just retired from 20 years in industrial engineering, and Mason, once a Navy mechanic, still carried that mix of curiosity and precision that made him double-check everything. They'd spent the spring saving up for a new sonar system, the kind that could map the lakebed in color and detail so sharp it looked like a photograph. It was their new toy, and this morning was its first real test. "Depth 26 feet, Mason said, tapping the screen. The image flickered shadows of rocks, submerged branches, schools of trout moving like drifting smoke, and then something appeared that made both men lean in. "Wait," Cole whispered, "do you see that?" At first, it looked like a ridge, but the shape was too perfect, two clean lines spreading outward like wings. The reflection was solid, man-made, symmetrical. Mason zoomed in, heart starting to race. "That's not a tree," he muttered. "That's a damn plane." And the boat rocked slightly as they stared at the screen. The outline grew sharper with each pass of the sonar sweep: fuselage, tail, wings. A small aircraft, maybe 30 feet long, resting upright on the lake bottom. It looked eerily complete, as if time had pressed pause and never resumed. Cole exhaled. What the hell is an airplane doing down there? They circled the area again, confirming coordinates, taking photos of the sonar feed. Mason radioed the ranger station, his voice trembling with equal parts excitement and disbelief. Within 40 minutes, a sheriff's patrol boat approached, its siren off but its urgency unmistakable. By mid-afternoon, the shoreline of Silver Pine Lake looked nothing like its usual postcard calm. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind, park officials and deputies gathered, and the Harrington brothers stood by answering questions. Divers in black wetsuits prepared their oxygen tanks. The news spread faster than ripples across water. By evening, a small crowd had formed along the shore: locals, hikers, families watching the water like it might suddenly confess something. The first dive took nearly an hour. The sun was beginning to drop behind the Rockies when the lead diver surfaced. He pulled off his mask, eyes wide. "It's a Cessna," he said breathlessly. "Registration still visible, N4728D. A murmur ran through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "That number. Wasn't that the one that went missing decades ago?" Another said, "My granddad used to talk about that pilot. Disappeared in '63. Cole and Mason exchanged glances. What had started as an ordinary fishing trip had turned into something that felt biblical, like the lake itself had chosen that day to give up one of its ghosts. The next morning, the Boulder County Sheriff's Department announced an official recovery operation. Local media arrived with cameras and tripods, reporters rehearsing their lines. The headline wrote itself: "Missing plane found after 62 years beneath Silver Pine Lake." By the second day, a diver brought up the first tangible evidence: a metal panel coated in silt, but still bearing the faint shimmer of silver paint. Another surfaced holding a small logbook sealed in a waterproof pouch. Then came the moment that silenced everyone. The lead diver surfaced slowly, gripping the side of the boat. "There are remains inside," he said quietly. "2 people, both still strapped in." For a long moment no one spoke. The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of resin and rain. Cole looked at Mason, both men realizing this wasn't just discovery anymore, it was closure for someone. The sheriff's office released the first statement that afternoon. The plane was registered to Captain David Whitaker, a 5-year-old pilot from Boulder who had vanished on the 17th of August, 1963, while flying a charter route to Denver. His passenger, businessman Frank Donovan, had been presumed dead as well. Search teams had scoured the mountains for weeks, but no trace had ever been found, until now. That evening, as crews packed up equipment, Mason stood staring at the water, now rippling under the amber sunset. "Think about it," he said quietly. "Every summer, every family picnic, all these years, and he's been right there, under all that silence." Cole nodded slowly. 62 years. That's a long time for the truth to hold its breath. The next morning, journalists from Denver and even out-of-state news outlets arrived. Drones hovered above the lake capturing footage. One reporter asked Mason what he thought when he saw the plane on the sonar screen. He paused, thinking. "It looked like wings," he said softly, "like something that never got to finish its flight." The story spread across national media within days. "The Lost Pilot of Silver Pine Lake" became the headline on every channel. Interviews with locals filled the airwaves, people who remembered the search in the 60s, families who had once brought flowers to the old memorial in Boulder. By day 3, forensic teams recovered more of the wreckage. Fragments of the propeller, a pilot's headset, even a watch stopped at 4:44 p.m. The detail sent shivers through everyone who heard it. That evening, standing on the shore, Cole overheard one of the investigators speaking quietly into his radio. "Get confirmation from NTSB archives," the man said. "We might be reopening the file." Cole turned to Mason. "Reopening? After 60 years?" Mason nodded. "Guess they want to know why he went down." The sun slid behind the ridgeline, and the lake turned dark, reflective, endless. Reporters packed up, and the brothers loaded their boat back onto the trailer. As they drove away, the sound of frogs and distant sirens faded into the night. Before leaving, Cole looked one last time into the mirror of the lake. He could still see faint ripples where the divers had worked, tiny circles widening and fading like breath on glass. "Some secrets," he murmured. "Don't stay buried forever." The next morning, a sealed envelope arrived at the Boulder County Sheriff's Office from the Federal Aviation Administration archives. Inside was a single weather log entry from the 17th of August, 1963, stamped, "Classified Weather Anomaly." No one had seen that document in over 6 decades. And as investigators opened it, one line stood out in bold letters. "Last transmission received, visibility 0, diverting toward Silver Pine Lake." The officer reading it looked up slowly, his expression pale. "What the hell happened up there?" he whispered. It began on a Friday morning, the 16th of August, 1963. The kind of morning that smelled like coffee, engine oil, and promise. At the small airfield just outside Boulder, Captain David Whitaker stood beside his silver and blue Cessna 172, clipboard in one hand, thermos in the other. He was the kind of man who always arrived early, whose uniform shirt was pressed even on days no one would see him. 35 years old, tall, with steady gray eyes that made nervous passengers relax before takeoff. People around town said David had flying in his blood. His father had worked on aircraft during World War II, and David himself had flown cargo planes for the Air Force before returning home. He'd seen enough of storms, engines, and loss to know that discipline was survival. His wife, Margaret, used to joke that he married the sky first and her second, and she never said it with resentment. She admired that part of him, the quiet certainty, the man who trusted instruments over impulse. That Friday, he kissed her goodbye at their porch door, promising to be home by dinner the next evening. 2 quick runs, he told her. Denver to Estes Park and back. Easy weather. Clear ceiling. Their sons, Ethan, age 9, and Caleb, 6, were building toy airplanes on the kitchen floor. "Bring us clouds, Dad," Caleb shouted. David laughed, ruffling his hair. "I'll bring you the whole sky." By the next afternoon, he'd deliver more than he ever meant to. Saturday, August 17, started bright and still. The Rockies shimmered in the distance like waves of blue glass. David met his passenger, Frank Donovan, a textile salesman in a tan suit who carried a briefcase and the restless energy of a man forever late. Donovan had chartered the flight to reach Estes Park for a business meeting, insisting he had to be back in Denver before dinner. David checked the latest weather report pinned to the airport wall. Light winds, chance of scattered storms after 5 p.m. Nothing unusual for summer in Colorado. He tapped the barometer, checked both fuel tanks each full to the cap, and scribbled WX good divided by 7.5 kelvins altitude on his log. At 9:32 a.m., Cessna N4728D lifted smoothly off the runway. The morning air was crisp, the kind of clarity pilots dream about. David leveled at 7,500 feet, trimmed the aircraft, and smiled when the engine purred in that even, perfect rhythm that meant every system was happy. To Donovan, he said, "Fasten that belt and enjoy the view. You'll never see God's work better than from up here." The outbound leg to Estes Park was easy. They landed at 10:11 a.m., sharp. David waited near the plane while Donovan attended his meeting, chatting with another pilot about weekend weather and a new storm front pushing in from Utah. By 3 p.m., gray clouds began gathering over the peaks to the northwest. David glanced up. He'd seen this before. Mountain weather could change faster than reason. Still, radar reports showed the storm moving northeast, away from their route. He filed the return plan and told ground control. Departing 4:10 for Denver, 1 passenger. At 4:22 p.m. they climbed into the air. The horizon had lost its shine. Thunderheads rose like towers of bruised cotton, spreading their shadows over the valley. David adjusted course slightly east to stay clear, radioing Boulder approach. Cessna N4728D, 10 miles north of Silver Pine Ridge, climbing through 6,000, en route Denver. Moderate chop. Copy. 4728 Delta. Maintain VFR. Report passing 8,000. Lightning flickered somewhere ahead. Donovan glanced nervously at the dark shelf of cloud. "Is it safe?" he asked. David gave the calm, practiced smile of a man who'd said the same words 100 times. "Safe as long as we respect it." 10 minutes later, the first downdraft hit hard, like a hand pushing them from above. The altimeter needle dipped 200 feet in an instant. David increased power, steadied the wings. Rain struck the windshield in heavy diagonal streaks. The once blue world turned to gray soup. Approach. 4728 Delta, requesting deviation east of Silver Pine. Weather building fast. Approved, Delta. Advise wind clear. He banked gently, keeping his eyes on the instruments. The artificial horizon tilted, then righted. Static hissed across the radio. Another jolt worse this time sent the briefcase tumbling from Donovan's lap. The man grabbed the seat edge, face pale. "It's fine," David said, his voice steady even as the altimeter spun. "We'll find a hole soon." But there were no holes, only rising mountains to the west and a growing wall of water ahead. Visibility dropped to 0. The Cessna bucked and shuddered, a leaf in invisible wind. Inside the storm, sound changed. The roar of rain became something deeper, more living. In Boulder, Margaret was folding laundry when the radio crackled with the evening weather alert. Severe thunderstorm warning issued for Larimer and Boulder counties. She looked out the window toward the darkening sky and frowned. It wasn't unusual for summer, but still she whispered a small prayer she'd learned as a nurse during the war. "Keep him steady, Lord. Keep him level." Back in the storm, David checked his compass spinning, gyro drift. He switched to the backup, scanning the panel by instinct. The windshield flashed white. Static exploded through his headset. He tasted metal in the air. Denver Center, 4728 Delta. Conditions deteriorating. Visibility 0. Request vectors. No answer. Only the hollow crackle of interference. He tried again, louder. "Denver Center, do you copy? I'm diverting toward Silver Pine Lake terrain low, attempting to stay under the cells." For a few seconds, the static softened, and a faint voice replied, half buried. "Copy. Advise. Maintain. Altitude." Then nothing. Donovan clutched the dash. "Can't we turn back?" "Too late," David said. "Mountains behind us. We're safer over water." Through the sheets of rain, a darker patch appeared. A glimmering gray mirror surrounded by shadowed forest, Silver Pine Lake. The same lake families would picnic by for decades without knowing. "Hang on," he said quietly. "We're setting her down." He retracted the gear, set flaps to 30, throttled back. The altimeter unwound toward zero. Every muscle in his body worked to keep the wings level. Wind screamed through the cabin seams. For a second, he thought they might make it a smooth ditching, just as he'd trained for. Then the microburst hit from above, a downward punch of cold air that crushed them. The yoke kicked forward, gauges blurred. The last thing David saw was the water rushing up like polished steel. At 5:12 p.m., the storm moved east, and the world went quiet again. No smoke, no fire, no wreckage on land, just a calm lake absorbing rain. By 7 p.m., Boulder Tower marked Cessna N4728D as overdue. Calls went out to search and rescue units. Helicopters combed mountain passes until midnight, their lights sweeping over mist and rock. They found nothing. Sunday morning, August 18. Margaret woke to the ring of the telephone. "Mrs. Whitaker," the voice said gently, "your husband's flight is overdue. We're initiating search operations." Her knees buckled. Ethan appeared in the doorway, still in pajamas. "Mom?" She straightened, forcing calm. "Dad's plane had to stop somewhere. They'll find him soon." But hours became days. The search grid expanded from Estes Park to Denver, across ridges, ravines, and forests. Pilots reported no sign, no oil slicks, no wreckage, no distress signal. The Civil Air Patrol logged over 150 flight hours. Journalists called it the vanishing over Colorado. Neighbors brought casseroles. Friends sat with Margaret at night, radio tuned low for updates. Sometimes, when the boys were asleep, she'd step outside, gaze toward the mountains, and imagine his voice on the wind. In one of her letters, never sent, she wrote, "You always said the sky keeps its promises. Please, let it keep this one." Weeks later, the official report arrived. Cessna N4728D presumed lost due to severe weather. Wreckage not located. Margaret refused to hold a funeral. She kept his flight jacket on the back of the chair, his watch on the nightstand. Stopped at 4:44 p.m. Years would pass. The boys would grow up hearing half-remembered stories of a brave pilot, a vanished plane, a lake no one thought to search. And for 62 years, the water above Silver Pine stayed calm, reflecting only the sky. Until one summer morning in 2025 when the Harrington brothers' sonar traced a familiar shape on the screen, and a name began to rise again. The sound of rotor blades became the anthem of August 1963. For 10 long days after Captain David Whitaker's plane vanished, the Colorado skies echoed with the thrum of helicopters, the whine of small search aircraft, and the static-laced voices of men calling into radios. "Negative contact. Grid 4-2 clear. Moving east. M." At dawn, the mountains looked deceptively peaceful, gold light crawling over granite peaks and mist rising like ghosts. Below, hundreds of volunteers trudged through forests and ravines with maps folded under their arms and binoculars slung around their necks. The command post at Boulder Airfield buzzed with motion. Coffee pots, cigarette smoke. Men bent over maps, dotted with red pencil marks. Every morning, Margaret Whitaker came to that post with her 2 young sons. She brought sandwiches, thermoses of soup, and the one thing no one else had hope. "Any news?" she asked each time, though she already knew the answer by the way people avoided her eyes. Ethan, only 9, tried to act brave, repeating his father's words. "You never quit when the sky's against you." Caleb, 6, clung to his mother's hand. Too young to understand, but old enough to feel the weight of silence. Search pilot George Langford, David's old friend, was one of the last to land each evening. He'd known David for over a decade, served beside him during the war, trusted him with his life. He told Margaret quietly, "If anyone could put that plane down in one piece, it's him." Margaret nodded, eyes glistening. "Then he's waiting somewhere. We just haven't looked in the right place." Day after day, the search widened. They scoured the foothills between Estes Park and Denver, the ridgelines around Rocky Mountain National Park, and the desert brush stretching east. Dozens of reports came in. Somebody heard an engine, somebody saw smoke, but each lead ended in nothing but dust. On the 6th day, a Civil Air Patrol team found wreckage of another plane, an older Piper Cub lost in 1949. The discovery made headlines but broke hearts. It wasn't David. The papers the next morning carried his photo beside the headline, "Pilot still missing. Family holds to hope." At night, when the boys had fallen asleep on the couch, Margaret sat by the window, staring at the silhouette of the mountains against the moonlight. Sometimes, she swore she could hear the low hum of an engine far away. She whispered to the empty room, "I know you're out there. Please, find a way home." By the second week, the search changed tone. The urgency of rescue became the slow rhythm of recovery. Reporters from Denver camped near the command tent, filing updates that sounded less like news and more like eulogies. The Civil Aeronautics Board announced it would reduce air operations pending new evidence. But Margaret refused to accept the word reduced. She wrote letters to the governor, to the Air Force Base commander, even to the president. "My husband would not stop searching," she wrote, "and neither will I." In early September, the volunteers thinned out. The weather began to shift: cooler mornings, shorter days. Funding dwindled. On September 10, the final helicopter landed at Boulder Airfield. George Langford stepped out, helmet under his arm, exhaustion etched deep into his face. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said softly. "We've covered everything. If he's down, it's somewhere the mountains won't give up." She managed to nod. "Then I'll wait until they do." That fall, the official report closed the case. Probable cause: weather, related loss of control during severe thunderstorm, wreckage not located. For most of Colorado, it was just another headline fading into the archives. But for the Whitakers, it became a quiet ache that lived in every meal, every holiday, every glance toward the western sky. Margaret returned to nursing full-time, balancing strength with grief. She never took off her wedding ring. On weekends, she took the boys to the ridge overlooking Boulder. They would sit there with sandwiches, watching small planes glint in the sunlight. "That one's flying level," Ethan would say proudly, pointing. "Just like Dad taught," Margaret replied. As the years turned to decades, the legend grew. People in town whispered about the lost pilot, the man who vanished into the storm. Hikers told stories of ghostly lights over the mountains at night. Teenagers dared each other to camp near Silver Pine Lake, claiming to hear engines echoing beneath the water. But for the Whitaker family, there was no mystery, only absence. In 1970, the Air Force placed David's name on the memorial for missing civil aviators. Margaret brought her sons, now teenagers, to the ceremony. Ethan stood stiffly in his borrowed suit. Caleb held his mother's hand. When they unveiled the bronze plaque, Margaret traced her husband's name with her fingers. "He didn't disappear," she whispered. "He's just waiting to be found." Ethan looked up at her. "What if we never find him?" She smiled faintly. "Then we'll keep listening." Time carried them forward. Ethan joined the Army during Vietnam, driven by his father's sense of duty. Caleb studied mechanical engineering, drawn to the precision of machines. Life went on: marriages, children, the steady rhythm of years, but the story of Silver Pine Lake never left them. When Margaret grew older, she often sat by her window, watching clouds drift and fade. "He's flying higher now," she'd tell her grandchildren. When she passed away in 2009, her final words to Ethan and Caleb were simple: "If they ever find your father, tell him I never stopped loving him." They buried her with David's old flight log in her hands. By 2025, the Whitaker brothers were in their 70s. Ethan, a retired history teacher, Caleb, a soft-spoken engineer. Both lived quiet lives, the kind that leave time for reflection. They still spoke about their father sometimes, though rarely aloud. It had become sacred ground, something you touched gently, or not at all. Then, one July morning, Ethan's phone rang. "Mr. Whitaker?" a voice asked. "This is Deputy Collins from Boulder County. Are you the son of Captain David Whitaker?" Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Yes, I am. There's something you need to see." An hour later, Ethan called his brother. Caleb picked up on the second ring. "They found him," Ethan said. His voice cracked. "They found the plane at Silver Pine Lake." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the faint hum of the line, the same quiet that had filled their lives for 62 years. Caleb finally whispered, "Does it ever feel strange that the story we grew up with is suddenly real again?" Ethan's throat tightened. "I don't know, but maybe it's time we stop imagining and start understanding." That afternoon, they stood side by side on the same ridge they'd visited as boys. From there, they could see the faint shimmer of Silver Pine Lake in the distance, surrounded by pines and shadow. Helicopters hovered above it, news vans lining the road below. The lake that had kept their father hidden for a lifetime was suddenly full of voices, cameras, and questions. And for the first time in 62 years, the Whitaker brothers didn't feel like orphans of mystery. They felt like sons on the edge of an answer. Ethan turned to Caleb and said softly, "If Mom were here, she'd tell us the sky finally kept its promise." Caleb nodded. "Yeah, but what's it about to tell us now?" The wind picked up over the ridge, carrying the smell of rain, the same scent their father must have breathed in that last flight. Below them, a line of divers stepped into the lake, their black suits cutting ripples through the mirrored water. Somewhere beneath that calm surface, the truth waited cold, preserved, and patient. As the first diver disappeared below the reflection, Ethan whispered, 62 years, and he's still holding her level." The lake swallowed the sound, as if listening. When the Whitaker brothers arrived at Silver Pine Lake, the world already knew. News vans lined the road, camera crews set up near the dock, and the low hum of generators mixed with the call of distant loons. The air was charged not loud, but electric, the kind of stillness that comes before a revelation. Ethan Whitaker, gray-haired and steady despite the tremor in his hands, stepped out of his truck. His brother Caleb, slower but sharp-eyed, followed close behind. Neither said a word at first. They simply looked out at the lake that had haunted their family story since 1963. The water was calm, innocent almost, as if unaware it had been guarding a secret for 6 decades. A young deputy recognized them immediately. "Mr. Whitaker? I'm Deputy Collins. The divers recovered several artifacts this morning. The NTSB is confirming identities now." He hesitated. "Would you like to see where they found it?" Ethan nodded. His throat was too dry for words. The brothers followed him down to the edge of the water. Floating just beyond the dock was a yellow buoy marking the recovery site. Around it, divers and forensic technicians worked in silence. A crane on a barge lifted a section of the silver fuselage, dripping lake water that glittered in the afternoon sunday. The number on its side was faint but unmistakable, N4728D. Caleb whispered, "That's her." Ethan blinked hard, trying to focus through the blur in his eyes. He named every plane he flew. "You think this one had a name?" "Maybe," Caleb said softly. "Maybe that's what he's been trying to tell us all this time." The crane swung the fuselage gently toward shore. When the metal touched the surface, the ripples spread outward, like the lake itself was exhaling. Inside a nearby command tent, the air was cool and sterile, filled with the hum of equipment. A woman in a navy blue NTSB jacket approached them. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Dr. Laura Kim, lead investigator. I want to personally extend our condolences. Your father's logbook and some personal effects were recovered intact." She handed Ethan a sealed evidence pouch. Inside was a small, water-stained leather book, still bound shut with a thin strap. Ethan stared at it as if it might vanish. "This was in the cockpit?" "Yes, along with 2 sets of remains. Based on dental records, we've confirmed the pilot as your father, Captain David Whitaker. The passenger, Mr. Frank Donovan." Caleb closed his eyes. So he wasn't alone. He stayed with his passenger until the end. Dr. Kim nodded. "From the condition of the wreckage, it appears your father performed a textbook ditching. Flaps down, gear up, engine still running. He did everything right. The impact was just too severe." Ethan swallowed hard. 62 years. And you're telling me he was still trying to save someone?" "Yes," she said quietly. "He never gave up." The next day, under a pale morning sun, the crane lifted the cockpit section from the water. The glass was fogged and shattered, but the shape was heartbreakingly familiar. Reporters hushed. Even the wind seemed to pause. When the wreck touched the platform, A single sound broke the silence. A metallic clink as something slid free and fell to the deck. Caleb bent down and picked it up, a pilot's wristwatch, its hands frozen forever at 4:44 p.m. He held it like a relic. "Mom used to say his watch stopped the moment he left us," he murmured. She was right. Ethan looked toward the lake. "She always said the sky would keep its promise." Caleb nodded. "Guess it finally did." Later that afternoon, the brothers stood with Dr. Kim as technicians cataloged debris. The team had found the flight instruments, gauges locked mid-readout, airspeed 80 knots, throttle 60%. Every indicator told the same story: control, order, calm. "He didn't panic," Dr. Kim said softly. "He stayed level to the very last second." Ethan turned the logbook over in his hands. The cover was cracked, the ink faint. When he finally opened it, the first line hit him like a voice carried across time. "The 17th of August, 1963, Denver to Estes, 1 passenger. Sky looks steady today." The final entry stopped halfway through a word. He closed the book gently, pressing it against his chest. "He didn't get to finish," Ethan whispered. "Maybe that's our job," Caleb replied, "to finish it for him." That evening, the sun set behind the Rockies, painting the water in streaks of fire and gold. The lake, once a grave, now looked like a mirror to another world. The brothers sat in silence on the dock, listening to the creak of ropes and the low hum of distant cranes. Ethan spoke first. "Do you ever wonder why it took so long for him to be found?" Caleb thought for a moment. "Maybe because we weren't ready yet. Maybe the truth waits until you can bear it." The older brother nodded slowly. "Maybe." As twilight deepened, the news crews began to leave, their lights flickering out one by one. Only the reflection of the moon remained on the surface, white, unbroken, eternal. Behind them, inside the command tent, a technician flipped through archived FAA documents delivered earlier that day. He frowned at one page and called out to Dr. Kim. "Ma'am, you might want to see this. The flight plan from August 17 lists a destination deviation at 4:40 p.m. Silver Pine Lake wasn't part of his route." Dr. Kim took the paper, reading the coordinates. Her brow furrowed. "That's 30 miles off course." The technician hesitated. "Except the compass data on the recovered instruments doesn't match the route either. It's like the plane wasn't where it was supposed to be at all." Dr. Kim looked up, eyes narrowing. Then what was he doing over that lake? Outside, unaware of the conversation, Ethan stood at the water's edge, whispering to the wind, "We found you, Dad." Behind him, thunder rumbled faintly over the mountains, distant, low but unmistakable. And for the briefest moment, the calm surface of Silver Pine Lake rippled again, as if answering. The investigation room at the National Transportation Safety Board field office in Denver looked like something out of a time capsule, maps taped to walls, satellite screens glowing with weather data, and a single photograph of the recovered Cessna pinned above the main table. It was the heart of the inquiry into one question that had haunted the Whitaker family for 62 years. Why did Captain David Whitaker end up over Silver Pine Lake? Dr. Laura Kim, the lead investigator, stood at the front of the room, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright with purpose. On the screen behind her was a grainy radar image dated the 17th of August, 1963. The colors looked faded, but the pattern was unmistakable, a tight, swirling knot of storm cells right over the mountain corridor. "Microburst," she said, pointing with her pen. "That's what brought him down." A few of the younger analysts exchanged glances. One of them, Mark Taylor, raised his hand. "Ma'am, microbursts weren't even identified until the late 1970 seconds. How could we be sure that's what it was?" Dr. Kim smiled faintly. "Because now we can see it. Technology caught up with the truth." She enlarged the radar frame. The storm looked like a bruise spreading across the state. This was a freak system, an early-season downdraft strong enough to push a light aircraft from 7,000 feet to the ground in less than 15 seconds. That's what happened to Captain Whitaker. Ethan and Caleb Whitaker sat in the back row, silent but alert. They'd been invited to observe the review, a courtesy, Dr. Kim said. To give the family the answers history never could. On the table in front of them lay the salvaged items, their father's flight log, his pilot headset, and the watch still frozen at 4:44 p.m. Ethan's voice broke the quiet. "So, you're saying he didn't make a mistake?" Dr. Kim turned toward him. "No, sir. Every instrument we recovered shows he handled that aircraft correctly. Flaps, throttle, gear, all textbook emergency procedure. He fought it all the way down." Caleb leaned forward. "Then why didn't anyone know? Why wasn't this discovered decades ago?" "Because," she said gently, "in 1963, they didn't have the tools to see what really happened. The storm erased its own evidence. And the lake," she looked toward the photo of Silverpine's calm water, "kept its silence." For the next week, the investigation unfolded like a courtroom for ghosts. Data from 1963 was re-entered into modern software, wind velocities recalculated, every gauge from the Cessna logged. When the simulations were complete, they gathered again to watch the digital recreation of the flight. The projection filled the room, a virtual Cessna flying southeast through growing turbulence. Numbers flickered: airspeed 95 knots, altitude 7,000 feet, then a sudden drop. Dr. Kim narrated softly. "He was here, 5 miles north of Silverpine. Downdrafts accelerating at 4,000 feet per minute. He reports visibility 0, radio contact lost. Then," she pointed as the simulation showed a violent downward push. "Impact in 11 seconds. The room fell silent. Even the hum of the computers seemed to fade." Ethan whispered, 11 seconds to make peace with the sky." Caleb rubbed his eyes, and he used every one of them doing what he was trained to do. Late that afternoon, Dr. Kim found Ethan standing by the observation window, looking out at the storm clouds building over Denver. "You know," she said, "I've spent 20 years investigating accidents. Most are about human error, small mistakes with big consequences. But your father's case, it's the opposite. He did everything right, and nature still won." Ethan nodded slowly. "He always told us flying wasn't about control, it was about trust. Maybe he trusted the sky one last time." "Doctor," Kim hesitated, then handed him a photocopy from the wreckage. "We found this in the maintenance log, written in your father's handwriting." Ethan unfolded the paper. The words were smudged but legible. "If I ever go down, I'll keep her level." He stared at it for a long time. The letters looked shaky, rushed, maybe written between flights, maybe long before that final storm. He felt his throat tighten. "That's who he was," he said softly. "He didn't quit." "No," Dr. Kim agreed. "He didn't." When the final report was released 2 weeks later, it made national news. The headline read, 1963, crash solved. Pilot acted heroically amid rare weather phenomenon. The report concluded, probable cause: aircraft encountered severe downdraft associated with microburst. Pilot executed controlled ditching consistent with emergency procedures. No evidence of negligence or pilot error. For the Whitakers, those words carried the weight of salvation, the myth of failure. The quiet, unspoken shadow that had followed their family was gone. Caleb called it the day the sky apologized. The Boulder City Council announced plans for a public memorial at Silverpine Lake. Reporters called for interviews. Historians requested access to family records. The Whitaker brothers, however, chose to stay quiet for now. They visited the lake privately at dawn, when mist still hung low and the world was soft enough for grief. Standing on the dock, Ethan looked at the water rippling under the breeze. "All my life, I thought he vanished because he took a risk. Turns out, he disappeared because he refused to give up." Caleb nodded. "Mom would have been proud. She never stopped believing he did the right thing." Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe that's why she waited so long to leave, so she could be the first to meet him when he came home. Later that week, Dr. Kim invited them back to the lab one final time. "We recovered something new," she said. On the table lay a small metal tube sealed with corrosion, a message capsule from the aircraft's emergency kit. Inside, remarkably preserved, was a folded scrap of paper with faded ink. Ethan held it under the light and read aloud. "For Margaret, Ethan, and Caleb, If you ever read this, know that I kept her steady. Love, David. Neither brother spoke. The air felt heavy with both loss and grace. After a long silence, Caleb said, "He wasn't writing a goodbye. He was leaving a report." Ethan laughed softly through tears. Yeah, he never missed one. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, the first storm of the new season. Rain began to patter against the glass, echoing the rhythm of that long-ago afternoon. Dr. Kim watched the brothers stand together by the window, faces lit by lightning. "He did everything right," she murmured again. Ethan looked out into the rain. "Then maybe the lesson isn't how he died, but how he lived." Caleb turned to him. "You think the sky remembers that too?" Ethan smiled faintly. "It kept him safe for 62 years. I think it remembers everything." Behind them, the recovered watch on the evidence table glimmered under the flickering light. For the briefest instant, it looked as if the second hand twitched one tiny, almost invisible movement before falling still again. And somewhere far above Denver, a streak of lightning split the clouds, illuminating the horizon like a curtain lifting on the next chapter of truth. The Boulder Air and Space Museum smelled faintly of polished wood, old paper, and aviation fuel. Its newest exhibit had just opened. The Lost Pilot, the story of Captain David Whitaker. At the entrance, a bronze plaque read, "He kept her level. El 17 de agosto de 1960, y 3 Silver Pine Lake, Colorado." For the first time, the Whitaker family name was no longer attached to mystery, it was attached to honor. Inside the exhibit hall, a crowd moved slowly past the displays. David's weathered flight logbook, his headset, and the cracked watch frozen at 4:44 p.m. A looping black and white photograph of his Cessna shimmered on a screen, while the soft hum of an engine played overhead. People spoke in whispers, as if the man himself might hear. Standing near the back, Ethan Whitaker and his younger brother Caleb watched visitors file by. Neither said much. They didn't have to. The silence around them was heavy but peaceful, the kind that follows after long years of noise. Ethan touched the display case containing their father's leather flight jacket. The familiar smell of worn leather and faint fuel made him blink hard. "Smells like him," he murmured. Caleb nodded. He'd probably be embarrassed by all this attention. "You know how he was quiet, stubborn, allergic to compliments." "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "But he earned every bit of it." Across the room, a young reporter from Denver Channel 7 was interviewing Dr. Laura Kim. "So, doctor," the reporter asked, "how does it feel to finally solve a mystery that's older than most of us?" Dr. Kim smiled gently. "It's not about solving a mystery. It's about giving a family their story back. The data gave us answers, but the humanity that came from the people who never stopped believing, he did everything right." The reporter nodded thoughtfully. "And what's next?" Kim looked toward the Whitaker brothers. "The next chapter belongs to them." After the segment aired, the story went viral. Social media filled with posts tagged number keeper-level pilots, veterans, teachers, even parents quoting David Whitaker's phrase as a metaphor for life. "Stay steady, stay true, keep her level." But not everyone was kind. A few tabloid outlets began speculating that the investigation had been too perfect, that the NTSB's findings were romanticized. One late-night host joked, "Maybe he didn't crash. Maybe he just wanted some peace and quiet." The jokes cut deeper than expected. Ethan stayed up that night scrolling through comments until Caleb found him staring at the screen. "Stop reading those," Caleb said quietly. "They don't know him." Ethan sighed. "Yeah, but that's the point, isn't it? They only know the story, not the man." He closed the laptop. "I think it's time we tell them." 2 weeks later, Ethan agreed to an interview on national television. The studio lights were warm, the set decorated with a small model of a Cessna and a framed photo of his father in uniform. The host, Marilyn Fox, asked him gently, "What do you remember most about him?" Ethan smiled, his voice steady but soft. "I remember his hands steady, careful, never rushed. He used to say, 'Flying isn't about fighting the wind, it's about trusting it to carry you.' That's how he lived. That's how he raised us." Marilyn leaned forward. Do you ever wish the truth had come sooner? He hesitated. Of course. But sometimes the truth waits until you're strong enough to face it. For 60 years, we thought we'd lost a man who made a mistake. Now I know we had a father who made the right decision and paid the price for it. The camera zoomed in as he added softly, he didn't vanish because of fear, he vanished because of duty. When the episode aired that night, it struck a nerve. Veterans wrote letters. Pilots sent messages of thanks. A retired air traffic controller from Arizona emailed, "Your father's final radio call was part of my training module. We always wondered what became of him. Now I can tell my students the rest of the story." Within days, news outlets across the country replayed Ethan's words. Even those who had doubted the report fell silent. The Whitaker name, once whispered like a question, was now spoken like a promise. Back in Boulder, Dr. Kim received an unexpected call from an elderly man named Sam Delaney. He had been a young journalist in 1963, the same one who'd written the headline, "Pilot Still Missing. Family Holds to Hope." "I kept the original interview tapes," Sam told her. "Thought they were junk until I saw the news. There's something you should hear." That afternoon, she met him at his small apartment overlooking the foothills. The old reporter handed her a dusty box labeled Whitaker Radio Archives. "I interviewed your father's colleagues back then," Sam said. "One of them told me David said something odd the week before the crash. I didn't print it because, well, it sounded too poetic." Dr. Kim frowned. "What did he say?" Sam smiled wistfully. "He said, 'If the sky ever takes me, it won't be because I lost my way. It'll be because I tried to help it find its balance.'" And that night, she played the tapes in her office. The voices crackled with static, men laughing, the clatter of coffee cups. Then came the line David Whitaker's voice. Clear, calm, resolute. "If I ever go down, I'll keep her level." The same phrase found in his maintenance log, the same promise he'd lived by. A week later, the museum hosted a small evening gathering to honor the completion of the investigation. A handful of reporters, local veterans, and aviation students attended. As the sun faded behind the mountains, the guests fell silent while Ethan stood at the podium. He cleared his throat and spoke softly, his voice carrying through the quiet hall. "My father's story isn't about tragedy. It's about consistency, about doing the right thing even when the world is falling apart around you. He taught me that steadiness is courage disguised as patience." He paused, glancing at the display of the recovered watch beside him. "That's why this exhibit isn't a memorial. It's a compass for anyone who's ever been lost. May it remind you, keep her level, and you'll find your way home." The audience rose in applause. Some cried. Even the younger attendees, people born decades after the crash, felt the pull of something timeless. Dr. Kim stood in the back, smiling through tears. Sam Delaney clapped softly beside her and whispered, "He found his balance after all." Later that night, after everyone left, the Whitaker brothers lingered alone in the dimly lit hall. The exhibit lights glowed like stars reflecting on polished metal. Caleb said quietly, "Feels like he's here, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, and I think he's proud we finally understood what he meant." As they turned to leave, the automatic lights dimmed, leaving only the display of the frozen watch illuminated. Outside, the sky rumbled faintly, another storm rolling over the mountains, soft and distant. Caleb looked up toward the sound. "Think he's flying in that one?" Ethan smiled. "No doubt. And keeping her level, just like always." The thunder faded, replaced by the gentle hum of the museum's air, vents a sound almost like an engine settling into steady flight. The morning of the dedication ceremony dawned calm and golden, the kind of light that makes the air itself seem softer, as if the world was holding its breath. Silver Pine Lake shimmered like glass beneath the Colorado Sunday. For the first time in 62 years, its stillness would be broken not by tragedy, but by remembrance. Rows of white folding chairs lined the grassy shore. A small wooden stage had been built overlooking the lake, decorated with flags, flowers, and a bronze statue of a pilot in flight jacket and cap, gazing toward the horizon. Etched into the pedestal were the words that had defined David Whitaker's story. He kept her level. The Whitaker brothers stood near the front, Ethan, dressed in a dark suit, wore his father's old wings pinned to his lapel. Caleb, slower to move these days, leaned on a wooden cane but carried the same quiet steadiness their father had been known for. Around them, hundreds of people gathered: pilots, veterans, reporters, and families who had followed the story. A hush fell as the mayor approached the podium. "Today," he began, "we honor not just a pilot who was lost, but a man who represented what it means to stay true, to remain calm when everything around you is falling apart. Captain David Whitaker didn't simply fly a plane. He taught generations, even unknowingly, how to live with purpose." Behind him, the lake glinted like a mirror. As the speeches continued, Ethan's mind drifted. The breeze off the water smelled faintly of pine and rain, just like that August afternoon in 1963. He imagined his father in that cockpit, hands steady on the yoke, rain battering the windshield, the sky shaking but his focus unwavering. When the mayor finished, Ethan was invited to speak. He walked to the podium slowly, the weight of decades carried in every step. The crowd rose to its feet before he said a word. "Thank you," he began, his voice low and steady. "My brother and I grew up not knowing what happened to our father. For most of our lives, the word disappearance felt like a wound that never healed. But what we learned this past year changed everything. He didn't vanish. He fulfilled his duty. He did everything right, even when the world gave him everything wrong." He paused, his eyes glistening. "If you've ever lost someone and wondered if they fought until the end, let me tell you, sometimes fighting looks like peace. Sometimes courage is just refusing to lose your balance." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of applause across the water. After the ceremony, the brothers stayed behind as the crowd slowly dispersed. Dr. Laura Kim joined them, holding a small box wrapped in navy fabric. "This was recovered from the cockpit floor during the final dive," she said. "We didn't release it publicly because it's personal." Ethan opened the box. Inside was a metal dog tag chain, half tarnished, half shining. The inscription read, "Whitaker David H. Uzaf," and beneath it, etched faintly, a second line, "For Margaret, always level. Un." Caleb swallowed hard. He had it engraved. "For Mom." Ethan nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wore hers until the day she died." Dr. Kim smiled softly. "Now they're together again." The brothers stood in silence for a long while, the sound of the waves gentle and rhythmic. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, the museum arranged a special flyover, a single Cessna 172, vintage and painted in the same silver-blue pattern as David's original plane. It approached from the west, gliding low across the lake. The pilot, a young woman in her 20s named Captain Lily Hansen, spoke through the radio broadcast speakers so the crowd could hear. "To Captain David Whitaker, thank you for teaching us what it means to stay level. This flight's for you." N. The aircraft climbed sharply, wings tilting in the traditional missing man formation before soaring into the orange sky. The audience gasped, many wiping away tears. Ethan felt his chest tighten not from sadness, but from something like release. Caleb whispered beside him, "He would have loved that." "Yeah," Ethan said, smiling faintly. "Except he would have told her to ease off the throttle." They both laughed softly, a sound that felt like the first true laughter between them in years. Later, when most of the crowd had gone, the brothers lingered at the edge of the water. The air had cooled, the reflection of the sky burning crimson across the lake's surface. Ethan took the dog tag in his hand and looked at his brother. "You think it's time?" he asked. Caleb nodded. Together, they stepped to the dock and knelt. Ethan lowered the chain into the water. The metal glinted once before sinking, the ripples spreading outward in concentric circles. The lake accepted it quietly, as if taking back something that had never truly left. Caleb exhaled. 62 years, and we finally brought him home. Ethan smiled, though his voice trembled. "Yeah, home isn't where you land, it's where you're remembered." That night, as darkness settled over the town, a storm gathered in the distance. Thunder rolled softly like an old friend returning. From their hotel balcony, the brothers watched the first flashes of lightning dance across the horizon. Caleb chuckled. You think Dad would have flown through that? Ethan leaned on the railing, eyes on the flickering sky. No, he said quietly, but he'd have watched it. And he'd have smiled knowing the sky finally got it right. A faint breeze brushed past, cool and clean, carrying the scent of rain and pine. Somewhere out over the lake, a single plane light blinked against the clouds, steady, unwavering, level. Ethan placed a hand over his heart and whispered, "Keep her level, Dad." The light blinked once more before fading into the storm, and for a long, breathless moment the sky stood still. Autumn came early to the Rockies that year. The pine needles around Silver Pine Lake turned golden brown, the air crisp enough to smell of wood smoke and cold stone. The summer crowds were gone now. The water lay quiet again, the way it had been before anyone knew what rested beneath it. Only this time, it wasn't a grave. It was a monument. A small wooden path led from the parking lot to the edge of the lake, where the new memorial stood, bronze wings mounted on black granite, polished so finely that the mountains reflected in their surface. The plaque below read, "In memory of Captain David H. Whitaker and passenger Frank Donovan, discovered July 2025, reunited with the sky." Each morning, a few people would stop by. A jogger, a fisherman, sometimes a veteran in uniform. They'd stand silently for a while, touch the stone and leave. But on this day, Ethan and Caleb Whitaker came back one last time. The brothers walked the trail in slow, familiar steps. Ethan carried a folded American flag, the same one presented to them at their father's reburial. Caleb carried a small tin box. Inside were three things: a photo of their parents from 1956, their mother's wedding ring, and the tiny model airplane David had given them when they were boys. They reached the shore just as the sun was breaking through the clouds. The water shimmered gold, and the bronze wings glowed in its reflection. Ethan laid the folded flag beneath the plaque. "This belongs here more than on a shelf," he said. Caleb nodded and opened the box. "Mom used to say love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go." He smiled faintly. "Guess it's time." He placed the box at the base of the memorial, the ring catching one last flicker of light before he closed it. For a long while they just stood there, hands in their pockets, breathing in the cool air. "You realize," Caleb said finally, "this lake used to mean loss for us." Ethan nodded. "Now it means proof." "Proof of what?" "That sometimes the world forgets, but the truth doesn't." Down by the dock, a few young aviation students were unpacking drone equipment, mapping the lake for a university project. One of them, a woman no older than 20, recognized the brothers. "Mr. Whitaker?" she called, approaching shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your father's story inspired me to become a pilot." Ethan smiled kindly. "What made it inspire you?" She thought for a moment. He didn't panic. He didn't give up. That's rare these days. Everyone talks about success, but nobody talks about staying calm when you're falling. Caleb chuckled softly. "Sounds like you already learned his lesson." She grinned and shook their hands before jogging back to her friends. When she was gone, Ethan said, "That's it, isn't it? That's what this all meant." "What?" Caleb asked. "That his story didn't end with us." Later that afternoon, they met Dr. Laura Kim at the ranger station. She'd just returned from Washington, where the NTSB had presented her with an award for the Whitaker investigation. She looked tired, proud, and still a little stunned. "They called it the persistent citation," she said with a wry smile. "I think your father would have laughed at that." Ethan laughed too. He probably would have said, "About time someone read the manual." They all shared a quiet smile. Then Dr. Kim reached into her briefcase and handed Ethan a small sealed envelope. "The FAA finally declassified this. It's from 1964, a follow-up to the original disappearance." Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a single page of typewritten text and a handwritten note from an Air Force colonel who'd served with David during the war. "If Whitaker's missing, he'll be missing doing the right thing. He always said the measure of a pilot isn't how high he flies, but how steady he holds when everything shakes." Beneath it, the colonel had written, "We don't lose men like him. We just take longer to find them." Caleb folded the letter gently. "Guess that's the legacy," he said. "Not the crash, the steadiness." That evening, they had dinner at a small diner overlooking the lake, the same one that had hung their father's newspaper clipping in the front window decades earlier. The waitress recognized them instantly and brought coffee on the house. Ethan looked out at the fading light. "Funny," he said. "For 60 years we thought the story was about loss. Turns out it was about how much a man can hold together before the world lets go." Caleb stirred his coffee slowly. "I keep thinking about that girl earlier, the student. Maybe that's the point. Dad's steadiness became a map. For her, for us, for anyone who's ever faced their storm." Ethan nodded. "Then maybe this isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the start of the lesson." As darkness fell, they walked back toward the dock one last time. The stars had begun to appear bright, clean, countless. The lake mirrored them perfectly. Ethan leaned on the railing and looked up. "You ever wonder what he saw in those last seconds?" Caleb smiled softly. "Yeah, probably this." The reflection of the stars rippled across the water, scattered but still shining. "Dad used to say," Ethan murmured, "you don't really fall when you fly, you just give the earth a chance to remember you." Caleb chuckled. "That sounds like him." They stood there in silence, the cold air brushing their faces. Somewhere far off, the faint hum of a small plane echoed through the night sky. Ethan looked up and whispered, "We hear you, Dad." The sound faded slowly until there was nothing left but the whisper of wind across the lake. Months later, the brothers received a final letter from Dr. Kim. The state had officially renamed the small inlet where the wreck was found, Whitaker Bay. Beneath the signature, she'd written a single line, "The sky remembers everything." Ethan framed the letter and hung it above his desk. Some nights, when the wind was right, he'd open the window and listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, he swore he could hear the faint rhythmic drone of a propeller somewhere high above the Rockies, steady as a heartbeat. He'd close his eyes, smile, and whisper the same words his father had written 6 decades earlier. "Keep her level." And in that moment, with the stars reflected perfectly on the quiet lake below, it felt as though the world was doing just that. The story of Captain David Whitaker is not just about the rediscovery of a long-lost plane. It is a mirror held up to the timeless truths of human resilience, devotion, and integrity. It reminds us that life, like flight, is less about conquering the skies and more about learning how to stay steady when the winds shift. David's final act was not one of failure but of extraordinary courage, choosing calm in chaos, reason in fear, and purpose in the face of inevitability. His words, "Keep her level," transcend aviation. They have become a philosophy for living. We all face storms, moments when visibility drops to zero, when every instinct tells us to panic or surrender. Yet Whitaker's legacy teaches that steadiness is strength. True heroism lies not in grand victories, but in the quiet discipline of doing what's right, even when no one sees it. The decades that passed before his discovery echo the patience required to find meaning after loss, to trust that truth will surface when the world is ready to hear it. For his sons, the lake no longer represents tragedy. It symbolizes reconciliation. For us, it stands as a reminder that time cannot bury character, nor can water drown honor. The calm surface of Silverpine Lake now reflects something greater than history, the endurance of love, faith, and moral courage. In a world driven by noise, haste, and fleeting recognition, the story of David Whitaker urges us to slow down, to navigate with intention, to hold our course when life trembles, and to understand that sometimes doing everything right doesn't prevent loss, but it does preserve dignity. His story proves that integrity may sink for a while beneath the waters of time, but it always rises again steady, level, and shining.